Hi, everybody. As we've been walking through the life of Jesus, lately we've been seeing Jesus wear a lot of different hats. 2 weeks ago, we saw Jesus as a miracle worker. And last week, we saw Jesus as a trainer, somebody that's teaching his disciples what it really looks like to follow him. And then this past week, we saw Jesus engage in the role of a storyteller. The situation with Jesus is that the spiritual landscape is very diverse. Some people are really open to what Jesus has to say. They're like one end of a magnet that just sucks up everything that Jesus says and sticks right to it. And a lot of people are like the other end of a magnet that just constantly repels anything that Jesus has to say. Something very interesting happens about halfway through the ministry of Jesus. He adopts a tactic where he begins to tell stories. And he calls these stories parables. Now, parables are fascinating things. A few things that are true about them is that they are earthly stories with heavenly intent. They use common everyday situations and occurrences to make a spiritual point. And Jesus was fond of using this technique. In fact, he tells over 25 different parables. Something that's also true about parables is that very often Jesus does not connect the dots for the hearers. He does not give the obvious interpretation of what does the earthly story point to, what's the spiritual point that he's pointing to. And he does this for a very specific, albeit curious, reason, even to the original disciples. In Matthew 13, we really pick up a big trail of these parables beginning to be rolled out and told by Jesus. And the disciples, they pull Jesus aside and they ask him a question. Chapter 13, verse 10, the disciples come to him and ask, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" And this is what Jesus says. "Because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have, will be taken from them. This is why I speak to them in parables." And at first that might seem a little bit harsh, but if you really think about it, what Jesus is doing is he is very eager to tell people what's important to him if they want to hear it. If they don't want to hear it, then Jesus simply stops telling them what's important to him. And we explored a few of these parables, and each one really ends the same way. Do you want to hear what Jesus has to say, or do you not care very much? Parables are there to encourage and give input to the receptive, but for the resistant, for the people that don't want it, his words fall on deaf ears. We looked at 3 parables. We looked at the parable of the soils, and each soil being an analogy of the condition of our heart. Then we looked at the parable of the mustard seed, how the kingdom of God begins small in the world and in a person's life, but if there's receptivity there, it grows to be an enormous impact and influence in a person's life and in the world. And then lastly, we looked at the pearl of the hidden treasure and of a great price, the idea that God's kingdom, God himself, is worth so much that we would eagerly, if we see it as it really is, we will eagerly sell everything and buy it. All those parables are in Matthew chapter 13, and they are just 3 of the 25 that Jesus gives. Really, the bottom line is, are we receptive to God's words to us? Do we want to hear them? If we do, God promises we'll hear more and we'll understand more. But if our hearts are closed and callous, then we will read them and not really hear much of what Jesus has to say. Enjoy some time discussing tonight these 3 parables that we explored, and also just the general nature of the condition of your heart before God and really what you want from God. Hi, everybody. As we push forward in the life of Jesus this week, we're coming to a turning point. The life of Jesus, eventually we know where it's going to end up, and he begins to take a tack. In Matthew chapter 16, he begins to explain to his disciples very, very clearly what's in store. And everything is riding on what the disciples think about Jesus. Who do they think that he is? And so after all the miracles, after so many teachings, Jesus asks the disciples point blank, Who do you say that I am? Who do other people say that I am? But who do you say that I am? It's in Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 to 20, and Jesus has a very direct, incredible interaction with Peter. Peter identifies Jesus as the Messiah, and then it's very interesting what happens after that. In your exploration tonight, move on from that passage and notice what comes next. What does Jesus talk about immediately after the disciples identifying his person and his mission? What does Jesus say next? And then in chapter 17, the front part of that, look for what Jesus does next. Who does he bring with them? Where do they go? And what do you think the purpose of this special interaction is right at the beginning of chapter 17? Jesus' ministry, his disciples know where it's going to end, but it's fascinating to watch him interact with them on the way to that sure destination of the cross and the resurrection. So explore that tonight. You might also share a bit of your own story about how you came to the point where you are now, where you say, who do I think Jesus is? And what has God done in your life to validate that for you? You have an individual story, but as you'll see tonight in this passage, you have the same story that Christians forever have had, discovering who Jesus is and then walking in his ways. Enjoy your discussion.